I'd almost want to ask you a question, Ray. Do you think you're born to do a certain kind of job or not? In spite of all of the resistance that you may run into. I think I was born wired to be a writer, wired to kind of live inside my imagination and to interpret the world my way and try to entertain people was what I saw. So I think I was always that way, but I was very actively discouraged from doing that for a living by guess who? My father. He provided me with very little encouragement to go into writing as a living. And wouldn't want to discuss why, but he would say, writing can be and instead of saying avocation, he would say, writing can be your avocado. He said, you can, but do not try to do this for a living. And anytime I would show him something I had written, from the age of 11 or 12 on, you kind of look at it and say, it's work, you know. He did not want to encourage me. So I think in my own mind, if I thought of myself as wanting to grow up to be a writer, I kind of like did not participate in my head in that conversation. My job was to do well in school. So that's what I did. I was good at that and, got good grades and ended up going to a school like Harvard. But basically, what I really wanted to do was to go into show business and entertain people. And the one opportunity I had in high school was to go on the radio. There was a local radio station in Manchester, WKBR, and it would occasionally let there's sort of like apprentices appear. So I started reading the news there and doing one show for my high school. And then when I went to Harvard, Harvard is such a cold and different atmosphere for a growing child. There's no coddling, there's no support system. You sink or swim at Harvard. At least that was what the message was back then. And the only way that you could like have a life in that community was to join an organization or an activity. The band, the Jewish Volunteer Association. In my case, it was radio because I had done radio in high school. And I discovered at that point that I really loved radio. I loved not only being on the air, but figuring out how to communicate something to somebody in a way that they could feel it mattered to them. And I think that kind of like attached itself to the part of me that not only wanted to entertain people, but that was a storyteller. So, I would look for opportunities to tell stories in one form or other that would be true stories, but that would be about people's lives and what they would go through, try to get them to feel what it was like to be another person. So that kind of slowly evolved. But for a long time, I was on the academic track because I knew that pleased my parents and that's what they wanted me to do, and I'd be safe if I were living in an ivory tower. So I studied Russian history and literature, and for a while I was making a career as a translator of Russian poetry into English, did about 4 books of that, but I was miserable. And it wasn't until 1968 when I was at that point a graduate student at Columbia, and the world erupted on the Columbia campus, and there was this whole left-wing swing and the youth revolt and all that kind of stuff, that I suddenly felt free to really pursue what I wanted to. So it was around that time, my mid to late 20s, that I just put that behind me and started looking for work in what turned out to be public broadcasting, which was just getting started at that point. It was a very exciting time to be working in television and then later in radio, public broadcasting, because you could do anything. It wasn't a big institution yet where all the ideas came from the top down. It was like a lot of young people interested in trying out something new and all knowing each other. So it was more like an artistic community of people centered, in this case, in Boston at Channel 2, WGBH. And that's where I started to get a lot of work experience about how to tell a story, how to work in a certain medium, to hear from an audience and get a sense of what it was that worked and didn't work. And I was lucky. I was lucky in one regard, in that people let me do what I wanted to do. There was no money involved no risk involved. I'd say, I think I want to do a half-hour special about adopting our son as a video. Say, okay, Go ahead and do it. Or I want to do some commentaries for the public radio station in Boston, WBUR, on whatever subject strikes me as interesting. Maybe I'll do it once a week. Go ahead and do it. I was so lucky. I don't know if that would be possible now, but I came to public broadcasting at a very early revolutionary period. And funnily enough, when I got to retirement age, uh, we were going through another revolution. And this was the digital revolution. And all of a sudden, the same kinds of opportunities that had come along in the early days were there again. You could try something because the stakes weren't all that high and people were investing an enormous amount of money. And so that's when I got involved in podcasting. And I was actually the very first podcaster uh, pretty much on the planet. There were only 20 of us who were doing podcasts back in 2004. But I just saw podcasting as another way of getting and telling stories and commentaries on radio to an audience that was not a broadcast audience. And what I experienced about podcasting in the early days was, I don't think it's present now because it's a big business and there's a lot at stake. But back then it was forming a community with strangers all over the world who were interested in what you were doing and let you know about it and could even become collaborators in what you were doing. So that the show that you would make as a podcast would kind of like express the interests of the community it was serving. That does not happen in broadcast, you know. So again, I was lucky and I was able to end my official career doing very new, exciting, experimental things that reached an audience of people all over the world. Half of our audience for one of the podcasts I did was in China. About 300,000 people a week would download the show, and 150,000 of them would be in China. And I'd say, well, why are they in China? Because they're learning English as a second language. And the teachers are having their students listen to stories in English, because that's a great way to pick up a language if you're interested in the story. So I think maybe I went from being a writer who would write anything to somebody who was really involved in figuring out how to get people to open up to each other through stories. That to me ended up being kind of like the focus of the work that I did.